Hello everyone, I'm Darcy Bono, and in this video I'm going to show you a couple of very easy ways to make snowy winter bases. Snowy bases are a simple but effective way to make your darker colored miniatures pop while still maintaining a grim aesthetic. It's also a really terrific way to make blood effects pop as well, though that may just be a bias due to my fondness for World Eaters. So we're going to cover two different techniques for two different styles of snowy bases. The first will be snowy drifts, like what you saw the Black Templar was on, and what this grizzly is wading through here, and the second will be on a more scattered snowy effect over a very cold stone. And before we get started, just to address a potential elephant in the room, if you've seen my other videos, you may notice that my voice sounds a little bit different in this one. So I'm not trying to do the weird ASMR thing. I'm recovering from a cold. This is as loudly as I can talk without sounding like a chain smoker. So that being said, let's get started. We're going to begin with a blank base that, big surprise, has been primed white. We don't want a miniature on this base yet because it'll make it much harder to sculpt the snowy drifts if you've got a pair of feet in the way. And as far as primers go, I highly recommend just picking up a hardware store primer in a flat matte white because we're not concerned about preserving detail like we would be if we actually had a miniature on this base right now. We're fine just having a really dense coat of primer on top. So for that reason, I really recommend Rust-Oleum 2 times the coverage. It's $7 and it covers the black base right away with just like the quickest little spritz. So get some inexpensive hardware store white primer and prime your base. Your next step is actually going to be what is ordinarily one of the last steps in the painting process. We're going to do the trim, and the reason why we're doing this now is so we don't get paint on our crisp white snow later. In this case, I'm using Russ Grey. It's a nice gray-blue color that is dark enough to define the border of the base but doesn't really clash quite as hard as using black does with the cool colors of the snow. It just helps give it a little more of a frigid look. Feel free to use black if you want, but if you're trying to go for a very cold appearance, definitely stick with a cool gray-blue. Alright, once that's dry, you can get to the fun part, applying the actual snow paste. Now for this, my secret weapon is Huge Miniatures Snow Paste. Unlike other products on the market, I feel like this has the perfect consistency for snow because it's fine grit enough to sculpt drifts, but it's also dense enough to where you can use it for powdered snow on the feet of your miniature. Many other products I've tried are either way too chunky. We're going to look at Citadel's Valhallan Blizzard in just a few minutes. And then other products I've tried are a little too fine grit. They're just not flaky enough in order to create multiple different snow textures. So this is my preferred snow basing product. So once you remove the lid, you're going to see this wonderful icing consistency. Literally every time I open one of these, I really want to eat a cupcake, but literally all you do is scoop it up as if it were icing. You can take a butter knife or a hobby spatula. You can get those at Hobby Lobby or Hobby Towns in the US. They're just little metal spatulas that are ideal for smoothing paste over your miniature bases. And all you do is you act like you're icing a cupcake. So take a dollop, spread the whole base with it, and then you can rinse your utensil, whether it's the knife or the spatula, come in fresh, and then just make kind of light curving lines in your paste. It's as simple as that. And because there's no actual paint in this stuff, you can easily swipe the excess off of the rim if it overflows. It's also very easy to redesign your pattern. You can just smooth the entire thing over and then redraw your drifts. Each drift is made just by pressing a little bit harder into the snow. Now keep in mind, you're going to want to sink your miniature into this paste once you have the designs you want. You don't want this to harden without your miniature in it, because if you just merely glue your miniature on top of this, once it hardens, you lose that depth of snow effect. So anything that is going to be on this base, whether it's your miniature or basing bits or tufts of grass, make a little indentation where that is going to be so it'll look like it's sitting in the snow. For this Black Templar, we're just going to put some glue on his foot and his rock and just sink him straight into the snow. It will harden with him in it and he will stay put. Once it dries, it's going to look like this. We have an idea of depth due to the miniature sitting in it. However, we only have a pure white substance as the snow. However, if you look at pictures of snow, you can see in the shadows it has a gray-blue look to it. Any textured surface is not going to have the exact same color in the recesses as it does in the raised portions. So what we're going to do to create a little more definition on this base while still preserving the smooth drift effect of the snow is apply a very thin, a very transparent shade coat over all of this, and that will be just enough to tint the darker recesses. So all we're going to do is apply a very transparent coat of Army Painter Battleship Gray. It's this subtle, pale blue, almost acid wash jean color, and I'm dating myself with that analogy, but all you're going to do is mix a 1:3 ratio of paint to thinner. You can use Lamian medium. It makes it even more transparent, but it does make it flow considerably more, and it could oversaturate your recesses. So I do recommend using the Army Painter Speed Paint Thinner. It just gives you a little bit more control with this shade coat. So there's nothing to this, just apply a very thin amount over top of this base and you'll see the recesses start to take on a slightly bluish tinge. So just spread that around and kind of push it as much as you can into the most shadowed areas. And if you notice the tops of your snow start looking a bit too tinted, you can always rinse your brush and just wipe it away from the tops of the drifts. We want those to remain mostly white. So here's what it looks like when it's completely dried. As you can see, there is a subtle shadow to the texture of the snow, as well as a cooler blue hue. Now this is going to be much more evident to your eye than it is to the camera. So if it doesn't look like much has been done here, it's much more of a pronounced shadow when you're actually viewing this in real life. So what we're going to do next is actually sink our miniature into this snowy environment by applying a kind of dusting of snow to the feet and to the rock that it's standing on. To do this, I'm using a very small makeup brush. This is an ELF concealer brush. You can get them for about $2 at any big box store that sells makeup. And the reason I'm using this is because it is great for stippling. Essentially what you do is just blot on the snow paste and then use that rounded but condensed tip of bristles to break up the dollop into patches of powdered snow. And you can be as heavy-handed with this as you like because there's really no paint in this snow paste. So if you put on too much, you can just rinse your brush and lightly wipe it away before it dries on there. So essentially you're just scraping it off onto your miniature and then blotting it, stippling it a little bit so it breaks up and disperses the snowy grit. And just because I know someone's going to say it, yes, that foot is misaligned on where that armor panel meets the toe. It's one of the push to fit miniatures, and clearly I did not push it in far enough or at the right angle. So it's totally okay. I can lift this guy up out of the snow and just align it correctly. So behold this temporary flaw. So here is the finished base. As you may notice, I added a few grass tufts. These are also by Huge Miniatures. They are their Frosty Grass series. The one in the front is one of their minis. They're perfect for much smaller models or just to create a difference in height of your grasses. The one on the back on the rock is their irregular grass tufts. They have a really nice natural pattern to them. They're not just perfect circles. So that's how I make my snowy drifts. Now, if you don't have access to Huge Miniatures, they are a US company. They ship internationally, but I understand global shipping can be expensive. So what we're going to do next is look at a slightly different snow effect using Citadel's Valhallan Blizzard. So Valhallan Blizzard comes in a much smaller quantity for around the same price as the Huge Miniature snow paste, and while it's marketed as a Citadel texture paint, I've noticed that the texture can vary wildly. I've had some that are very chunky and are mainly just good for dry brushing the dusting of snow like what you saw in the last step. I've seen some that are very goopy to the point where there's almost no texture to it. It's just kind of a weird bubbly mix. So the consistency is kind of a mixed bag. Ultimately, what it's supposed to be is something in between really goopy and really chunky so that you can actually spread it. This is what it looks like when it's spread over a white base in the same way that we did the snowy drifts. As you can see, there's way more texture to it. It's almost of a fluffy snow look, but is a little bit too irregular. I don't know, it just doesn't look quite as natural to me. So mainly what I use it for is creating a dusting or a scattered snow effect. So this is generally what my stone looks like before I put snow on it. To get to this is super simple. This was actually prepared well beforehand for a commission I was working on, so I'm going to show you really quick just how I got to this result. Starting with a mid-tone gray surface, something like Mechanicus standard gray works fine, any kind of dark to mid-tone gray, and then all you're going to do is just very heavily dry brush this in white. Some of you may have heard this referred to as slap chop. I grew up with it being called undershading. We're just creating some rough highlights and shadowed areas before applying a shade coat. For the shade coat, I'm just using Army Painter Speed Paint Occultist Cloak. I'm not even going to thin this properly. I'm just going to slather it over top, then immediately rinse my brush and use the water from that brush to thin this and spread it around. Since we're going to be putting snow over top of this, we really don't need to worry about pooling, so we're not using speed paint thinner. That helps you smooth out your speed paints a little bit more, but in this case, we really don't need it, so we just need it slightly thinned and able to flow easily over the surface. Hey, check it out, my voice is completely normal because I'm doing these voiceovers several days later. Anyway, this is Valhallan Blizzard. When you open the lid, you'll be greeted with something that looks kind of like really chunky glue, and this batch is honestly a little bit more on the goopy side, but your application process is going to be the exact same regardless. I'm using a filbert shaped brush. It's basically kind of like a trowel shape. This is a cheap synthetic brush that I get from Michael's. It has fairly stiff bristles, so the stiff bristles combined with the shape of the brush make it great for actually shoveling up the paste, but it actually does bend enough so where you can help feather the paste out. And this will make sense as you see me apply this more, but essentially you're just scraping it over the edges and then lightly feathering it away so it has a slightly more powdered effect rather than just a hard, crusty surface. For more textured surfaces, like on the rubble here, it's just dry brushing. You can do that to just have a light dusting, or you can shovel more on, as I'm going to be doing here, to create more of a powdered drift, but it's not going to have quite the same appearance as what you saw in the previous technique. And similar to the huge mini snow paste, this doesn't have any actual paint in it, so if you make a mistake, if you feel like you've overdone it, you can easily wipe this away while the snow is still wet. And just one more thing before we finish, I cannot emphasize enough how useful these ELF makeup brushes are when applying this snow paste. Whether it's the huge miniatures or Valhallan Blizzard, they have very densely packed bristles, which means you can both easily scoop up the snow and stipple with it to help feather it out and break up the larger, chunkier bits into a more realistic powdered effect. They're also only $2 to $3 at most stores, so you can't really beat that as far as an inexpensive but incredibly effective tool when it comes to hobbying. Alright, so that is how I make my snowy bases. Thank you very much for putting up with my whispery voice for most of this video. I'm back to 100% now, but I hope you enjoyed this and learned something new, and I'd love to see how you're able to create your own snowy bases using these techniques. So thanks very much for watching. If you found this useful and you'd like to see more videos, make sure to like and subscribe, as there are a lot more on the way, including how to paint this very intense power sword. So stay warm out there, and until we meet again, happy painting, everyone.